Check. Check. Okay. Good evening. Welcome all. Welcome to the meetup, TechX. Today's thing is about best practices about Spring Boot and also about few things about Spring, Core Spring. We have Joris with us, who's the CTO. And to begin, let's just quick walk through the agenda. We will have a short introduction about this TechX, what this meetup is all about, how did we start, and what we are aiming for. Post that, we'll have a first session by Joris, and then quick 15 minutes break, and then again question answers, and a few more sessions with Joris. And then we break for drinks. Cool. So this is our team. We started this in mid of 2018. We were a group of 5 people, and slowly the group increased. So we are a team from different teams in the bank. So we call ourselves the enthusiastic developers who try to bring new things to the bank and also try new things for ourselves, learn, experiment, and share. That's how we formed this thing, and we were called ourselves as an innovation circle. So we were trying to experiment, and that's how we came up with this meetup, which is also one of our outcome. And we are still working on other things, like having some trainings and other things for the developers in the bank, so everybody are up to pace, and together we can build something better for the bank and also for the outside world. Special mention to Eddie, who's in the middle. It is because of him that today's meetup is happening. He had won a raffle in the Spring 1 tour, where the topic was like he can speak with Joris alone, if required, for 3 hours. But he was, his goodness that he wanted to have it as more as a meetup, so everybody can get this idea about Spring Boot and know more things and ask more questions about Spring Boot. So special mention to him, but he's not here, but he has a message for you guys and for Joris as well, as he is busy with another meeting. And for today, we are the host. Unfortunately, you have to bear us for a couple of minutes. That's me, Vivek, and I have Patrick with me on the other side. So we are currently doing the host for today, and we are also coming up with a next event, which is about DevOps, where we have 2 speakers. One is me, which I got to know today, and the other one is Tiago. Tiago is works for Linkit, and he's going to talk about burning down the ivory. The meetup invite is already open, so if you guys are really interested about DevOps and journey to DevOps, and to know about the outcomes or the hard things that we had to pass through, please join this session on the 15th of October. Yeah, we are also hiring. We are always hiring, looking out for young and challenging people who's very interested. When I say young, it's not by age, by mindset. So if you guys are interested, please log into that place, or you can always talk to one of us. Now, to the actual and the fun part. Joris. Joris is actually a CTO of application development in Trifork, and he was also working as a senior consultant in Spring Source in the past. He's a trainer, good speaker. Without any further ado, I give it to Joris.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me quickly get connected here. That should work. Yeah, sure. Ooh. Yeah, there's my native resolution. Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for having me. Tonight we're gonna do 2 talks, but it's basically a big one that I'm gonna just stretch out a bit across the 2 sessions, where I'm gonna talk about Spring Boot. As mentioned, I was actually given away as a reward when we did a raffle at the Spring 1 tour in Amsterdam, and that Eddie won. So basically my management put me up on stage and said, you can win yours and you can do everything with him you like. So I was given away as a consultant. But then Eddie said, well, if we're going to have our pick anyways, why not let everyone benefit and do a meetup? So that's why I'm here. And I talked to Eddie to say, well, what would you like me to talk about? It's probably going to be something Spring related because that's my usual topic. But he said, well, here at ABN AMRO, we've started to work with SpringBoot a little over a year ago. There are some people who already have some deep knowledge, but still a lot of people catching up on how to do things as well. So maybe we can do some stuff around that. So that's what we're going to do tonight. So as mentioned, my name is Joris Kuipers. I work as a hands-on architect in Trifork. And already for like a year and a half now, I'm also the CTO for application development there. But I still focus way too much on the hands-on bit. Which means that I'm still doing a lot of live coding and help to build systems. Actually, a little disclaimer, this weekend we had a system that I've been working on for a little over a year already to go into production. And that was part of a big platform actually that went live at the Dutch lotteries. So I was there around midnight on Saturday and things were not actually progressing the way that they hoped they would. So I was there until around noon, and then I said I'm going to take off before I fall asleep behind the wheel going back home. So I think I had about an hour of sleep this weekend. If you find me doing strange things, it's probably that. I'm open to being corrected while I'm starting to talk nonsense during the presentation. Apart from leading the company and building systems, I'm also still a part-time Spring trainer. That's sort of my background. I used to work for a company called SpringSource, which was then acquired by VMware and then spun off into Pivotal. And actually, I think it was only like 1 or 2 weeks ago that they announced that VMware is going to acquire Pivotal again. So now it's going to be part of VMware again. I'm not sure if that means anything for Spring, the Spring guys there. But we in Trifork are the official training partner for Pivotal. So if you want to take their official 4-day Core Spring course, you can take it with us. And I'm one of the 2 people delivering that training. So that's my credential, so to speak. What is it that I was planning on doing tonight? It's actually 2 things. I have a presentation and a lot of demos with, let's say, a collection of Spring Boot tips and tricks, which I'm going to do. But also, given that not everyone here may already be, let's say, an experienced Spring Boot user, I thought it would be a good idea to do a quick intro to Spring Boot first. And instead of doing that, let's say, in the form of a presentation and just going over slides and telling you about Spring Boot, what I want to do, if the demo gods will allow me to, and my sleep-deprived brain is collaborating, is I'm just going to basically start from scratch to build a Spring Boot application. And then for the next half hour or so, I'm just going to run you through a bunch of the feature sets that Spring Boot provides so that you all have a good basic understanding of what Spring Boot is and what it's like to develop applications with it. And then from there on out, we will start with a tips and tricks session. I'm planning to start with that this first session, and then we'll take a break. And then we'll do the majority of that after the break. Feel free to ask questions at any time, basically. Obviously, if you have questions not directly related to the stuff that I'm talking about or that I'm demoing, you can ask me in the break or you can ask me at the end. But if it's stuff that I'm just explaining and showing and you want to know more about that, feel free to just interrupt me and raise your hand. Right? We're not with that big of a group, so we can make it a bit interactive. So first, as I said, intro to Spring Boot, time for live coding on sleep deprivation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build from scratch a simple Spring Boot application, just to explain a bit of the feature sets. Now, when you want to get started with a new boot app, you could just do it from scratch, right? You can set up a new Maven or Gradle project yourself and then put in the right dependencies, but there's an easier way to do that. And probably some of you at least are already familiar with a website called start.spring.io. There is an application running here, which is called the Spring Initializer application. And what you can do with this thing is you can just ask the application to scaffold a basic empty project for you. I can choose between supported languages. I can choose between build tools, but for demos, Maven tends to be a bit easier there. The version of Spring Boot you want, I'll just go with the latest release version here. But you can see you can choose milestones if you want to. Then enter some Maven coordinates. So we're at ABM, right? So let's say nl.abn and then do an artifact. So maybe something like ABN boot demo. Now, if I would just say create a project now, I would get an empty project, but it wouldn't really have much of dependencies there. So what I want to do is I want to build a little web application, and I want to have a database behind that. I'm going to access some of the data in that database using JPA. So I'm going to add some dependencies for that will automatically be included in my Maven POM that will be generated for me. So here, I can say I want to build a web application, so I want to have a so-called starter. I'll explain what it is in a moment. I want to have support for JPA, as I mentioned, and also because I'm not going to actually set up an external database in a half-hour demo. I want to have an in-memory database, so I'm going to use H2 for that. And well, let's just start off with this, and I'll add more stuff as we go along. So I can now generate a project, and basically I'm just going to get a zip file. So I can open up that zip file, and I can extract that to somewhere on my file system. So let's do that here. It's called ABN boot demo. And now I can just import this into my IDE of choice. My IDE of choice happens to be IntelliJ. So I'm going to say, open up this thing that I just created, which is over here. Point to the Maven POM and say I want to open that up as a new project in a new workspace. So just wait a sec while that's running. Yes? Me personally, yes, but for like the first 12 years or so of my career, no, actually that's a lie, it's way more. I used to work mostly in Eclipse, WSAD, Rational Application Developer, STS, all Eclipse-based IDEs. So I actually think that STS is a great choice for developing. It's just that a couple of years ago, I worked on a project where, an existing project, where it was much easier to set it up in IntelliJ, so I just learned myself IntelliJ, and ever since then, I haven't really looked back. I tend to prefer IntelliJ for a number of smaller reasons. I don't think it's one big thing that makes it much better. I think it's lots of small things. But I do have, like I said, many years of Eclipse experience, and I think it's still a fine IDE. What I don't have that much experience with, but which looks really good to me from what I've seen so far, is the Visual Studio Code for more of a lightweight environment. And I know that there's lots of boot support for that one as well. So what I'm going to do is two things. I'm going to start a little tool here that will allow me to zoom. There we go. And I'm also just going to make this a little bit bigger so that it's easier for everyone to see. And then I'll get into the meat of the demo. There we go. It's a bit sluggish. It's probably still doing some stuff in the background. So I'm going to use a custom bigger font here. And then I'll make this one a bit bigger as well. That should do the trick. Okay, so on the left-hand side, what we see here is just a standard Maven project. So we have a Maven POM, and we have a source main Java, source main resources. I'm assuming if you're a Java developer that you're familiar with this layout. But let's zoom in a bit and have a look. So the Maven POM is something I'll quickly walk you through in a moment. But you can see that next to that, we have these Maven W and w.command. What that actually is just a nice to have. It's something called the Maven wrapper. And it's actually copied from an idea that Gradle supports because they have the Gradle wrapper. And basically what this is a script that allows you to run Maven and download it if you don't have it already. So you only need to have Java installed to actually run this thing. Also, you're guaranteed to actually use the right Maven version for your project if you use this, rather than just depending on whatever Maven version a developer happens to have installed on their laptops. So that's a nice addition that you get for free. There's a little help file, but it doesn't contain much. There's a default git ignore that just ignores the most commonly used files for your build system and for your IDEs. So that's just a little helper, right? It has nothing to do with SpringBoot itself, but using this initializer, you get that for free. What we also get is this Maven POM here. Let me scroll in a bit and make that a bit bigger. There we go. So what do we see here? We see basically a standard Maven project. with the coordinates that we entered. But you can also see that we have a parent here. We automatically get a dependency on the Maven parent POM from SpringBoot starter parent, as it's called. And through that, we're going to get mostly a ton of managed dependencies, which means we can use common open source dependencies, Spring itself, but also other open source projects without having to specify a version number, because we will get one from this. And the same applies to Maven plugins. So a lot of Maven plugins will be pre-configured basically by the parents. So that's how that works. Basically what you're going to do then is you're going to do an import of a so-called bill of materials POM. I'm not actually going to code it, but you can look it up in the reference manual. If you want to have your own starter, if you want to have your own parent rather than using the SpringBoot starter, it's fully supported. The only thing that you will not get that way is the plugin management, because in Maven, this is just a Maven limitation, you can only get plugin management from a parent POM, so you will have to manage that yourself in that case, but you can still get all of the managed dependencies by using a so-called bill of materials or a BOM POM. Right? I didn't make up the name, sorry for that. This is convenient, but especially in bigger enterprises, right, there might be like these architects somewhere that you don't speak to and you never know who they are, and they have made a decision that you need to use the company parent POM or something like that. So if you need to do that, that is fully supported, not necessarily recommended. By default, it's set to use Java 8, which is the minimum version that is required because we're using Spring 5. Spring 5 actually has Java 8 as a minimum version nowadays. But obviously, Java 9, 10, 11 are supported. They're working on supporting Java 12 in the new versions as well. So that's all there. And then you see that we have these two special dependencies here. One is on something called SpringBoot Starter Data JPA, and the other one is on SpringBoot Starter Web. What these are basically is commonly combined sets of dependencies. So what I want, like I said, is I want to build a web app. So what do I need for that? Well, I need Spring MVC. I need a dependency on the servlet spec so that I can refer to those types. But I'm going to run this on Tomcat, actually as an embedded container, so I need Tomcat included. And well, most web applications nowadays actually don't really render HTML on the server anymore. They just use JSON back and forth. So I probably want to have a JSON library like Jackson included. And by saying I want to have the SpringBoot Starter Web, I'm just going to get all of that conveniently packaged into a single dependency. So this is basically just a way to save me from having to specify many dependencies. I can just have one common one. It's optional, right? You don't have to use the starters. You could just include all of the dependencies yourself, but this is quicker, so especially for a demo. Same thing here with the data JPA. This gives me Hibernate as a JPA provider. It gives me the JPA, the Hibernate APIs, but it also gives me a framework called Spring Data JPA, which is a very convenient way of building repositories that will, where you don't have to write all of your JPQL queries yourself. They will just be derived or configured. It saves you a lot of boilerplates, basically. And again, through this starter, we get all of that here. We get my database. We get a test dependency, so we can write integration tests. And finally, we get a plugin, which is called the SpringBoot Maven plugin, and I will show you what this does in a moment. This is mostly what the initializer provides us with, and this is really not something that you want to have to type in for every new project or copy over. Next to that, we get a main class, and this one is very straightforward because all it does is it says, I'm going to have a class here with a main method that says Spring application.run, which is the Spring Boot way of bootstrapping a Spring application. And it has a Spring Boot application annotation. And that's it. From here on out, we can start coding. So what am I going to do? Well, I was going to build an application that has a database, so I need something to store in my database. So let's say I'm going to create a new Java class. We'll call it a person, and I'm going to say this is going to be a JPA entity, and it's going to have a field to store our database ID. So let's say that this is the @ID, and I want the database to handle this for me, so it's a generated value. And I want to have maybe a name for a person, something like that. Let's say that we create a constructor that will easily allow me to create that person with a name. But then I also need a default constructor for JPA, so I'm going to add that. and then maybe a getter for the name or something like that. So really basic JPA entity that I just coded up. Next thing I want is I want to be able to store this stuff in the database and retrieve it again using some repository. So I'm going to code that. Now, for this, I'm going to use this framework called Spring Data JPA, which is automatically included with the starter that I have. So I'm going to create an interface now rather than a class, which I will call person repository. And what I can do with this interface is, that's a bit too big. I'm going to say this thing is going to extend a JPA repository interface. And this is parameterized, so I need to say it's a repository for a person, and the primary key type of that person is a long. And by doing this, I'm automatically going to get a shitload of methods implemented. So what you can see here, this interface provides me with things like counts, deletes, find all in various versions. I can do with examples. I can do find by primary keys. I can save new objects. I can even save collections of objects. All of that is basically coming now for free. In addition to this, I could also code my own methods here. So let's say that a person has a name, but obviously a name is not necessarily unique. I could say something like, I want to have a list of person here. List is going to be the Java list. There he goes. That one. And say I want to have a find by name method where I'm just going to enter a name. Name, typing is hard. If I do this, then actually the framework will be able to infer based on just a naming convention. You want to have a finder implemented that queries by the name property of this person object that you have there and then return all of the matching people, basically. Obviously, you can easily take this too far, right? If you want to do naming-based queries, conventions, I've seen people doing projects where they have method names like this because they're basically encoding SQL in a Java method name. Please don't go there. If you want to do something like that, you can use a net query annotation. You can just write a JPA query. But for my trivial use case, this should suit me just fine. So that's my repository, and I have a database now. So next up, I want to build something on the web. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Why do we use class? Why do we use class thing instead of a primitive for the IDs? Like in the extends JPA repository.
Okay, this one you mean?
Not only here, but in the JPA repository.
Oh, yes.
I think it not, yeah. So the long is a class right now, right? It's not a primitive data type.
No, what this is the type of the field in my person object. Mm-hmm. That is the primary key field. So if I look at person, it has an ID which is of type long. So it's basically referring to this particular long. And the reason I'm using a capital L long here rather than a simple type is that when I create a new person in memory, a transient object in JPA or Hibernate speak, it doesn't have an ID yet. So I don't want that thing to be a 0, I want it to be null. And so obviously I need a nullable type here to represent my primary key type. So that's a common thing to use with JPA and Hibernate.
Thank you.
Next up, I'm going to build a web layer. So for that, I'm going to use a controller, as it's called in Spring MVC. I'm going to have a little person controller. And because it's easier to demo, I'm going to make this a so-called REST controller, which means it's not going to render HTML based on a template or something like that. It's just going to marshal stuff to JSON. And in my person controller, I want to use my person repository that I just coded. So I'm going to create a field for that, add a constructor that Spring will use for dependency injection. And then I'm going to write a method to give me some people. So let's say I want to see a list of everyone. So I'm just going to have maybe a /people method here that returns a list of person. And basically all I need to do in order to implement this method is to just use my repository. So I'm going to say person repository find all, and that's it. Trivial, stupid controller method that just passes the result along to the web, marshalling it to JSON as we go, as you will see. I could now start this thing, and what you will see is that it will actually start a Tomcat application. It will bootstrap Hibernate with a database, and my application will be running. The problem is I have an empty database if I do that, so there will be nothing in it. Let's see, what are we going to do? Okay, I'm feeling lucky. So instead of actually bootstrapping the database in code with some people, I'm just going to create another post mapping here to slash, which is going to create a new person object for me when I do a certain post. So this thing will be void, and it's going to be called create person, which will take a string. Let's make that a request parameter or something like that. Or no, while we're at it, let's just do it like this. No, that's ambiguous. Let's not actually do that. Let's do it like this. So request parameter string name. And then based on that, we're going to say person repository dot save new person with that name. That should do the trick. So what I did now is I wrote an entity, I wrote a repository, I wrote a controller, and I did nothing else. For those of you working with Spring and not SpringBoot, you would expect now that I would now need a ton of default configuration to say, oh yeah, I need to bootstrap Spring MVC, so I need to configure a dispatcher servlet, I need to set up a local container entity manager factory bean. Only people that do trainings can actually say this from the top of their heads. To bootstrap JPA, I need something to create an in-memory database for me. I'm not actually going to do any of those things because I'm going to rely on SpringBoot doing this for me. So that's one of the main features that Boot provides. So with that, I just remembered, probably from my deploy in the weekend, I actually still have an application running on localhost 8080. So let me quickly stop that first. There we go. I should now be able to start my demo app. So let's see if that works, or if I made any mistakes. So what it's going to do now is, actually, I didn't create a run configuration in IntelliJ myself, but IntelliJ, as does STS, by the way, automatically detects the fact that you're building a Spring Boot application and then creates a run configuration for me. So based on that, it will start up now. Apparently, I just saw in I'm running with Java 11. Should work, even though I compiled it for Java 8. You could also run this with Java 8, doesn't really matter. I'm going to get a lot of output here. So what you see is that I get some nicely colored logging output and a nice ASCII art banner. This is something you can change. I'm not actually going to demo that, but it's a really popular feature for a lot of people to say, I want to have my own project-specific banner here in place. But what you see here is it's starting up. It defines that it's going to start up a Tomcat as a servlet container running on port 8080. Then you see some initialization stuff from Spring. So it's setting up a connection pool for my database. It's bootstrapping Hibernate. It's bootstrapping then some other JPA stuff. And now it's running. So what I should be able to do now is actually go on a command line. Let's make that a bit bigger. And then make a request to localhost 8080/people. And this will return all of the person objects in my database, which it does because it's an empty array. Right? This is not much of a demo yet. So what I need to do next is I need to be able to actually create a new person object. For that, I created something where I could post to the root if I'm not mistaken, but I need to include a request parameter and say I want to create a new person object. I'm getting a 200 OK, and if I'm making the request again, I now see that I have added one new person to my database. Now, obviously, I can create some more people. So let's add Eddie. There we go, my tribute to the organizer of this conference, or this talk, I'm sorry. So this is how you see how I can easily set this thing up. Now, the most important thing about this demo is the stuff you didn't see, right? As I said, I didn't set up a dispatcher servlet. I didn't register it programmatically or, God forbid, create a web.xml deployment descriptor. I didn't have to set up the whole JPA configuration. I even have a database, right? And the only thing I did was I added a dependency. I said I want to have an H2 database, and then all of a sudden you see in the startup that stuff is happening. So the question is, why is that? And this is basically Spring Boot doing its work. Yeah. Yes, that's exactly it. So the question is, why do I only see the name property and I don't see the ID? And it's because by default, Jackson library, which is used for the JSON marshalling, renders properties rather than fields. So what I could do here is I could add a getter for the ID. It's interesting that it's not suggesting that. Not sure why that is. Let's just code it out then. There we go. And now if I restart my application, then I'm going to have an empty database again because it's an in-memory database, so I'm going to add a person object again, and then if I do a get, I should see that I now also have IDs. Right, so let's do this, and have a look. Here, now I see the IDs as well. So that's indeed how that works. I'm going to do a couple of things now. I'm going to explain a little bit about why this stuff actually works, but I'm also going to show you some more features. Let me start with one feature based on this question. When I made the change here to add the getter, I needed to restart my whole application. And if you're a Java developer, you're probably used to that, right? You make a change, you change actual Java code. So typically that requires you to restart your Java process. So you pick up the changes in the new class files after compilation. And this is something that people who are working in dynamic languages like Ruby and PHP and JavaScript will just make fun of, because Java developers are unproductive because of this, right? It can take a long time to do this stuff. Now, Spring Boot cannot make this go away, but it can at least help you a little bit. So one of the things that we can do is here in the Maven POM, we can add another dependency. I'm going to add a dependency here to something called the Spring Boot DevTools. Let me make that a bit bigger. Here it goes. Apparently it still needs to be downloaded. Oh, the group ID wasn't included. That's weird, and it should be automatic. There we go. By adding this dependency, what I'm going to get is a functionality provided by Spring Boot that is only aimed for use at development time. So this is not something that's actually going to be packaged up with your application and deployed into production. It's just something that's going to be active while you are developing locally. And what this thing does, let me show you when I restart once more, because I do need to enable this first. Yeah, there we go. Is one of the things that, well, you're probably not noticing, but I'm going to mention it here, is you see now the name of my thread has changed. It said main before, now it said restarted main. That's a signal that these development tools are active. Basically what this does, in a nutshell, is it creates an extra class loader, right? So I'm going to be a little bit technical here, but basically when I start up an application, I have my own classes, the stuff that I code, which is very little in this case, right? It's a controller, an entity, and a repository, so only 3 classes. Then I'm going to have tons and tons of framework classes from Spring, from Hibernate, from Jackson, and everything else being loaded. And I'm going to have Java itself doing all of its internal class loading. And what Spring Boot will now do is it's going to create 2 class loaders, and in the top class loader is going to load all of these third-party classes, because they don't change, right? As I'm developing, as long as I'm not updating any dependencies or adding new dependencies, those classes remain the same. So they are loaded in one class loader, and then it creates a dedicated class loader to load my custom classes. And it then creates an application context. Now what happens is when I make a change now to my code, and I compile it, then it's going to detect that there is a change, and it's going to close my Spring application context. It's going to throw away the class loader that has my custom application classes, create a new one for me, and then start Spring again. That will still take some time, obviously, like it's not instant, but it prevents me from having to restart the whole Java virtual machine and from having to reload all of the third-party classes. And as it turns out, and especially the Spring Boot team, as of late, has done tons of performance testing to profile the startup times of Spring Boot applications to make them faster, for example, as part of serverless functionality. Most of the time is actually spent in loading classes, right, when you start up a new Java application. So this can save a lot of time. So I can do a quick demo with this. Well, I'm really lazy now, so let's just get rid of the getID here. And that's it. Now, if you were working in Eclipse, actually, you could now just press save, and that would trigger an incremental compile. IntelliJ doesn't work like that, so I'm actually going to do a build by using a shortcut, pressing Ctrl F9, and that will trigger a build and a restart. Yes?
I believe there is also a setting in the compiler so that you can override the default behavior so that you don't need to press the build.
Yes, you can actually tell IntelliJ you want to do incremental compiles on every save. Yeah, absolutely. But it's not enabled by default, so I'm doing it myself here. What you can see now in the output is basically the same startup logs again. So it has restarted my application. That means that if I request this, I'm again going to get my empty database because, well, that was part of my application state, so it's been restarted. So I can add some people again, and then request again. And now, again, the ID should be gone because I removed that getter, right? So this is just a feature that will speeden up your development cycle because it's faster than a complete restart. Yeah.
Did you ever face some problem by using the dev tools? Because sometimes there are some issues that app class loader and
Yep.
Bootstrap class loader, they don't load the same amount of classes.
Yep. No, I have had issues with this. Not all frameworks do things with class loaders that are fully compatible with the SpringBoot dev tools. Actually, and this is not something that I'm going to explain in detail, but there is an advanced feature where frameworks can actually include a file that will automatically be picked up by the dev tools to indicate that certain classes, for example, should be loaded in this other class loader. So frameworks that really have tested this and have fixed these issues, they will ship with those files. As an example, at Trifork, we have developed a framework called the Axon framework, which is for building CQRS event sourcing based applications. It was actually done by our former CTO, and he's now at a separate company called Axonic, where they continue to develop this framework. They have spent a lot of time on making sure that Axon integrates really well with Spring Boot. They ran into some of these issues, and they fixed them by actually providing a dedicated configuration file for the DevTools. And I know of some other popular open source frameworks that do this as well. So yeah, there may be issues, but if you have them, I would report them to the framework developers, and they can actually fix them, because there are hooks for this.
But there are no ways that we can fix it within our application.
You could also try to write a file like this yourself if you know what you need to change. It depends on how much effort you want to put in this, right? I think it's a nice feature to have. I don't think it's life-changing. So yeah, you can spend an hour on it trying to fix it, and if that doesn't help, I would just file an issue with the project. Yeah, so that makes sense. Another thing, by the way, that this thing will do is it's going to automatically configure a bunch of settings that make sense for development. For example, instead of using something like JSON rendering, you might want to use some server-side templating library for HTML. A popular choice there is something like Thymeleaf, for example, which I'm a big fan of. By default, frameworks like Thymeleaf, they use caching for templates so that they're more efficient when rendering them. But you don't want caching if you're developing. If I'm developing something and I'm changing a template to have some other markup, I want to be able to just press F5 in my browser and see the results. I don't want to have to restart my application for that, obviously. So in the DevTools, it will automatically set some properties that tell Thymeleaf, oh, you should disable caching. So these sort of development-only features are enabled automatically with this as well. And there is some functionality that this thing will prevent from running in production, because obviously there is overhead involved here, and you don't really want to do this when you're running in production. Let's see, what's the time? We have some time. What I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to do two things. I'm going to explain a little bit about how this stuff actually works. And I'm going to show one other feature, then I'll dive into that a bit more in the next presentation. First, why does this even work? What happens here, right? I just say I want to start up an application, I have some dependencies, and I have all sorts of configuration there. This is one of the main features, actually, that Spring Boot provides, and it's called Autoconfiguration. If I go back here to this annotation, I can actually show you what this annotation looks like in source code after I download sources for the latest version here. And what you can see here is that actually this annotation, this one Spring Boot application annotation, is a combination of some other annotations. There is a Spring Boot configuration annotation there that's basically just saying every class that has this annotation becomes a configuration class. You can define Spring Beans in this class and it will be found. There is an add component scan. So it will automatically enable Spring to search for classes that have an add component annotation, or an add service, or an add repository, or an add REST controller in my case, right? The REST controller was automatically picked up, that's because of that. And then you see the enable auto configuration, and that's really where the magic happens, so to speak. What that thing basically does is it tells Spring Boot at startup to evaluate a whole bunch of Spring configuration classes. So for example, I have JPA support, as you saw. So I can search for things that are called something with JPA and auto configuration. And then what I see here is that we have a class which is called JPA repositories auto configuration. So JPA repository is Spring Data JPA. over there. And if I open that up here, then what I'm getting is a class, which is just a Spring configuration class, but it has all of these conditional blah, blah, blah annotations. So what this does is it says this configuration should only be activated when certain conditions hold. So typical conditions that SpringBoot uses here is you have to have something available on your class path, right? If there is no Spring data on your class path, we're not going to configure Spring data because it's not there. So that's one of the things there. You can see it's conditional on class JPA repository, which is the interface that I just implemented. If I don't have that on my class path, this thing will just not apply. It will be evaluated still at startup, but it's just going to be ignored because the condition doesn't match. You can see some other things as well. Like it says here, if there is already a bean of type JPA repository factory bean, oh, I'm not going to do anything. Because what that means is you have your own Spring Data JPA configuration. And that's a typical feature in SpringBoot, right? SpringBoot says, hey, you have all of this stuff on your class path, but you didn't provide any configuration. You probably want me to do something with this for you. And that's when it's going to provide its own configuration. But you can always override that by saying, no, I want to do something different than what I get out of the box. I'm just going to provide my own configuration. It will automatically back off, which I think is, it's silly to say, but it's actually one of the most important features of a framework like this is that you can actually disable it, right? You don't want to be in a situation where you're building a project for half a year and then you're finding out, oh shit, but now actually I need to do something and it's just not allowing me to do this. And this will never happen with Boot. You can always do your own stuff and tell Boot to just back off. There are some other things in here. For example, I can actually use a configuration property to say I want to enable or disable support for Spring Data JPA repositories, even though it's on my class path. How does that work? How would you do that? How would you confine a configuration property for Spring Boot? Well, actually, one way to do that is we're going to have a file called application properties. I have an empty one over here already in my source main resources, and I can configure this here. Does anyone remember the exact name of the configuration property that I needed to type? Probably not, right? I never remember these things. There are hundreds of configuration properties. I don't remember them all by name. I don't need to. I remember it was something with JPA and something with being enabled, so I'm going to type JPA and I'm going to type enabled. And what I see now is that my IDE actually suggests, oh, there is a Spring Data JPA repositories enabled annotation, and by default it's set to true, but I can set it to false. And if I start up my application now again, it's just going to disable this support, and then I'm actually going to get an error because I have no repository and the controller expects one. This is, of course, not the only thing that you can configure here. There's actually tons of stuff. So, for example, for a database, if I'm running this thing in production, obviously I don't want to use an in-memory database. I want to use a connection pool that talks to Postgres, MySQL, whatever I have configured. Now, I could do that by configuring a complete connection pool in Java as a Spring Bean method. But actually, there is a much easier way to do this, because for a data source, I can just provide some basic configuration here, like a username and a password. And a data source URL, right? And obviously, if I do that, I probably don't want to do that in a file that is packaged up inside of my application in source main resources. I would actually want to do it in a file that's external to my application, because this thing changes from deployment to deployment. So you can also have an application properties file that you put in your working directory. And that will actually have a higher priority than the application.properties that you have inside of the class path. So you can have both files and they will both be used, but one is able to override settings from the other. And now, again, that mechanism is all built in, right? So very briefly, I showed you how auto configuration works. I could tell way more about that, but I'm not going to do that now. I've showed you that there is built-in support for doing property-based configuration. I've showed you the basic structure and layout of a Spring Boot app, showed the dev tools. So I'll show you one more thing. Right now, I've only been running this application in my IDE. Now, of course, that's not how you're going to run an application in production. You're going to do a build and package it up for that. So let me go to this directory here, and I'm going to use this Maven wrapper script that was provided to say, I want to actually package up my application. So I'm going to do that now. it might actually need to download a newer version of Maven than I have, I'm not sure. No, it's already there apparently. It's running my integration tests. This thing will just bootstrap an application context, see if that works. You can extend that yourself. And then it's going to package up the application, and then it's going to be done. Now, that went way too fast to actually see what it did. But if I go to my target directory here, where the build is being done, I can see that I now have 2 files actually in here. There is a jar file which is called .original, which simply has the stuff that I just wrote. That's tiny, of course, because I didn't write much. But there's also this other jar, which is now a 36 megabyte jar. And what this thing is a so-called fat jar. And it contains everything I need to run my application, including Spring, including Tomcat, including Hibernate, but also it will actually bootstrap the application itself because it's an executable jar. So what I can do now is I can say java just jar and start it up like this. And now I can actually run the application. So this is different from the traditional war-based deployment format where I'm going to ship off a war file and then someone needs to deploy that to a servlet container or an application server. This thing is now self-contained. This is not a requirement. Sometimes I get people that look at this and say, it looks nice, but I have to say it, I work for a bank, so I'm not allowed to use this. Right, we're at ABN AMRO here. I'm not sure how you're running your boot apps, but it's quite typical that companies have invested already a shitload of money into expensive WebSphere server licenses, and they really want you to just provide a WAR file so they can deploy it to WebSphere, regardless of whether that makes sense or not. Boot still allows that. You can very easily actually tell Boot, instead of creating a jar file like that, I want you to create a traditional WAR file, deploy that, have a mechanism to bootstrap the app. So you can still benefit from all of the other things that Boot provides in that scenario. Right? I think it's important, again, to know that, because otherwise, tons of people working for companies where you cannot say, I'm going to have an executable jar, would not be able to use the framework. That's not the case. However, this thing is now running, so I should be able to now split windows here, and then again make a request to 8080/people and see that we have nothing configured. And it works, right? So that's the fat jar. And as I said, it's optional, but I think it's nice. And this is especially nice if you're moving towards Docker-based deployments. Because if you're going to do Docker, you need to run a single process anyways, and you need an easy way to capture that into a single Docker image. It's actually quite tedious if you have to set up a Docker image for something like Tomcat, and then deploy a WAR file into that as part of your image. It's much easier if you do a single thing. The other thing is, it's a best practice in general to say, I'm going to have one application per Tomcat or whatever server you're running anyways. But then very often you need all sorts of custom settings. So maybe to run on Tomcat, I need to configure the remote IP valve, because otherwise I'm not going to see the IP addresses of my end users. I'm just going to see the IP address of the load balancer that forwarded the request to my application. That's something you do in Tomcat. It's not something you do in Spring. But now that I control both Tomcat and Spring, because they're part of the same thing, I can actually make sure that this thing is enabled in the way that I need it to, rather than having to write a deployment manual for whomever is responsible for taking my WAR file and then deploying it onto Tomcat on my behalf, right? So it makes the whole thing, I think, quite a lot nicer and easier to do it like this. Now, I think we have like 10 more minutes. So I'm going to leave it with this for the intro. I think this gives you a pretty short but good understanding of what Boot is actually providing to you as an application developer, right? Saves you from having to do lots of configuration. It has some other features as well, but I'll go over some of those in more detail later on. And then with this, I'm actually going to start with the tips and tricks section for those of you who already knew all of this. So I'm going to start that by going back to my presentation here. And I'm going to discuss a particular feature that Spring Boot provides, which is called a default error page. And especially I'm going to talk about that in the context of applications that just render out JSON, as I did in my demo. So if you're building a Spring app and one of your controllers throws an exception itself, or maybe just some odd-code exception that bubbles up the stack, then in a plain Spring application where you don't handle that, you would get something like a Tomcat provided error page where it probably shows a big stack trace. That's not very good. It's also not very secure. So what Spring Boot does by default is it says, I'm going to have an error page for you if an on-code error happens. If it sees, based on the user agent of the HTTP request, that it's a browser that asks for, that does a request, then it's going to render a very basic empty white HTML error page, which is called the white label error page. You typically want to override that. For programmatic clients, like when I do a command line request, as I just did in my demo, it's going to render some JSON instead. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. And I'm going to do that based on a set of demo projects that I have here. This stuff is all in GitHub, and I'll actually give you a link at the end, so you don't have to take notes or take pictures or whatever. All of this code is freely available here. Let's close all of this first. And I have an MVC, very tiny sample project here. What I have is this is all based, this whole presentation, this demo is done based on the concept of loot boxes, as you're probably familiar with, right, from games where you can buy stuff and then hopefully it's useful, and maybe it's not. In this case, I'm going to make a request to purchase a loot box. And to do that, I need to provide a product EAN, just to say this is the thing I want to buy, and I want to say how much money I'm willing to spend on this. In the Netherlands, they have now introduced regulations on this, right? Especially for loot that you can actually sell to other players for real money, because that's just gambling. And well, you can do gambling if you're the Dutch lotteries, but you cannot do gambling if you're just some game company in the Netherlands. So there are some regulations on this. What we have here is a trivial SpringBoot app that just starts up, has a controller that takes an incoming request to do a purchase, and then does some validation. So it checks if the fields are there and if they are correct. Because I go back to the request here, you can see that they have to be not null, these fields, and they need to either follow a certain pattern, like 8 digits, or it needs to be a positive amount of money that is smaller than 25 euros. So let's start this up. This is the MVC errors demo. And then, in the meantime, let's prepare a request on the command line to make a request to this thing. So it's going to run on port 8080, which is the default port, and then the controller was mapped to /. And what I need to do is I need to provide a JSON object with a product EAN parameter. And that needs to be 8 digits. And I need to provide a euros to spend field. Now I'm using a little command line client here called HTTPy, which is like curl, but for humans. Especially its JSON support is excellent. So this is a very easy way to create a JSON object with some key value pairs. Let's say I'm going to spend 10 euros, and this should work. So I see, hey, a request was valid. So this is good. But now I'm going to make an error. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to spend 30 euros, and I'm going to make an error in my, let's say I'm going to make a typo here. So my product EAN is now going to just be product N, right? So I'm actually missing a field. Boom. There we go. What we get is tons and tons of JSON now. This is a really long response. We're seeing that we have a bad request, which makes sense because we had a validation error. It's also a 400, as you can see at the top. But then what I'm seeing is errors that have arguments, which have arguments with code and codes. Then there is binding failure where there is more code with more codes. So this doesn't really make sense. If you look at this from a client's point of view, you have no idea what's happening. And that's because what Spring is doing here, it's just dumping out some internal data structures onto your users. This is not a very good default if you're building an actual API where you're expecting clients to call this thing and look at the results, right? This is very hard to understand. What you're seeing here is basically that these are all different keys that Spring could use to actually resolve this error code into a human readable message. But it doesn't actually do that. It just dumps out all of this internal message stuff. So internally, how validation works in Spring is it causes something called field errors when you have a binding error. And these field errors extend a class which is called default message source resolvable. You don't need to remember that, but it indicates that we could resolve these errors through a message source. But it doesn't work. It doesn't do that by default. Instead, it's just taking these field errors with all of the internal data stuff, and it's just marshaled as is out to JSON. And that's why we're getting all of this code and codes and argument stuff. I don't know about you, but it makes my eyes bleed to actually look at this, right? You don't want to force clients of your APIs that you're building to actually go over this and then make sense of what happened. You want to get a nice error message. Now, wouldn't it be nice if you have something that says, I am actually resolvable by a resource message, by a message source, if it was actually resolved into a human readable error message. Now, the good news is, it's very easy to tell Spring Boot that you want to have a different way of rendering these errors, because you can define your own bean of type error attributes. So going back to my code here, I actually have set up a class for this already. So what do we have here? We have a class which extends the default error attributes, which is what Spring Boot uses by default. What I've done here is I've provided an overridden version of a method that gives you the error attributes. What it does is it uses the default implementation from Spring Boot, but then I have a little helper here where I'm going to look into this map of error attributes and says I'm going to get the errors out. And this happens to be an object that is a list of object errors. And then what I'm going to do is, if I'm finding them, I'm going to say, well, instead of just dumping these things out on the user, I will actually resolve these error messages and then just replace the data structure back with the actual resolved error messages. So this is the code for that. I'm not going to go over the details in too much detail, but basically what I do is, if I say I'm getting an error that is specific to a field, like my field must be not null, then the default message for that will only state must not be null. That's still not useful to an end user, right? If I say, hey, you're providing me with 10 fields, and then my only error message is must not be null. I need to know what field should not be null. And ideally, I would also be able to see what value I provided if it's something else. And so that's actually what we're doing here. We're saying if it's field errors, I'm going to do a little bit of extra work to make a nice error message. Otherwise, I'm just going to use the resolve message and put that in. Now, this thing can simply be picked up by Spring Boot by saying, just do a component scan for this. And as soon as there is a Spring Bean of type error attributes, it will automatically override the built-in default. So this is, again, Spring Boot Autoconfiguration doing its magic, right? Simply by providing something, you tell the framework, oh, then if you have provided an error attributes bean, you probably want me to use that one instead of the default one. So this is all I need. Now with this, I should be able to restart my application, because I don't have the DevTools enabled, and then make the same request again, but now I should get a much, much nicer error message. So let's go back here, do another request, and now what I'm getting back is an error that says, hey, there's actually two errors. Your product EAN must not be null, but it was null because I didn't provide one, because I made a typo. And my euros to spend must be less than or equal to 25, but you actually passed in 30. So this is something that people can understand. And what I like about this is that you could actually spend time for every individual controller to make really nice customized error messages. Maybe you should if you're actually building a dedicated REST API, but it's a lot of work. With this, you get like a quick fix where at least you have a sensible default that will probably suffice for most of your cases. And of course, you can still do nicer error messages for specific cases that you want to handle separately. But at least this makes the stuff that comes out of the box much more user-friendly, I think. And it's just one class away. As I said, you don't need to remember this or take notes. You can find this code in my GitHub. And then with that, we're going to take a short break. And then after the break, we're going to look at another feature that I haven't explained yet. So I will do that next and then show you some advanced use cases for that. So let me first check. Are there any errors, any questions so far? No? Then okay, come up to me during the break if you think of anything, and otherwise I'll see you after the break.
So we'll have a 15 minutes break, and at 7:45 we'll resume the next session. There are some drinks outside.